Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabby Ross, and I am a housing advocacy organizer for NLIHC's field team. We're happy to have you on today for NLIHC's Policy Priorities webinar for 2022 in preparation for Capitol Hill Day next week on the 24th. Today, we'll be taking you through our policy goals for this year and providing resources on how you can take action. Presenting today will be Kim Johnson, Senior Policy Analyst, and Sarah Sadian, Senior Vice President of Public Policy. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I want to quickly go over some resources for Capitol Hill Day next week. We will be sharing our virtual Capitol Hill Day Advocacy Toolkit, which outlines the policy priorities we'll be discussing today, as well as talking points, data resources, and fact sheets for the bills we support. The NLIHC field team will also be holding office hours for anyone to drop in with any questions or concerns they have in preparation for Capitol Hill Day. The first will be on March 18th from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and the second will be on March 21st from 11 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. There will also be a staff room open on Capitol Hill Day for anyone to drop in to receive assistance in prepping for their Hill meetings, and you can receive assistance from NLIHC staff. And now I will pass it over to Kim Johnson. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gabby, and hi, everyone. I'm Kim Johnson. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst here at NLIHC, and I'm here with our wonderful Senior Vice President of Policy, Sarah Sadian, to talk about our priorities for the upcoming Capitol Hill Day. So thank you all so much for joining. And before we kind of hop into where we're going this year, I wanted to take a second to recap some of the victories of the last couple of years, which is especially important at a time when it can feel like victories are few and far between. So in March 2020, Congress enacted the CARES Act, which provided $6 trillion to states and communities to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. That funding included $9 billion for housing and homelessness programs and $150 billion in flexible coronavirus relief funds that communities can and have used to construct affordable housing and to expand the availability of non-congregate sheltering. The bill also provided a limited moratorium on evictions and foreclosures in federally assisted housing. In September of 2020, housing advocates pushed the federal government to enact a federal moratorium on evictions, which helped people already struggling under the weight of the pandemic avoid the trauma of eviction. In December of 2020, the Emergency Coronavirus Relief Package provided $25 billion for emergency rental assistance and extended the CDC's eviction moratorium. And the American Rescue Plan Act provided another $27 billion for emergency rental assistance, along with almost $20 billion in housing and homelessness assistance. In total, advocates helped secure nearly $85 billion in emergency housing and homelessness assistance since the start of the pandemic. If I could get the next slide, please. In March of 2021, we launched the House campaign to push for the long-term, bold investments in affordable housing that are truly needed to address the nation's affordable housing and homelessness crisis. The Build Back Better Act, passed by the House in November, would have provided $150 billion in affordable housing and community development funding. And while that bill that was passed by the House is no longer really up for consideration, we are not giving up on securing the investments in housing, vouchers, public housing, and the National Housing Trust Fund that we have been fighting so hard for. And with that, I will hand it over to Sarah to talk about our first priority for 2022, securing targeted affordable housing investments in any reconciliation package. Sarah?
Hi, thanks for that recap, Kim. It's really impressive, I think, to look back a little bit further about all the work that we've done over the last couple of years with advocates on this call. I want to talk a little bit about what our goals are for 2022. And I'll start with a reconciliation package. I know that many of us have spent many hours over the past year focusing on Build Back Better and ways to expand the resources that were available for affordable housing in it. We were able to secure through those efforts and through the efforts of our congressional champions, really robust resources in the Build Back Better Act for housing, and especially robust resources for our top 3 priorities for the House campaign. Just a quick recap of that. Those investments included $25 billion to expand rental assistance to another 300,000 households, $65 billion to preserve public housing for the more than 2 million residents who live there currently and for future residents as well, and $15 billion to build new housing and preserve existing housing that's affordable to people with the very lowest incomes. And we estimate that that would result in about 150,000 units of housing. Since this bill passed in the House, we have seen that the path forward for Build Back Better is largely over. However, we know that congressional leaders and Senator Manchin, the White House, are still engaging in conversations about how to move forward with a budget reconciliation bill, even though they're not calling it Build Back Better. They've largely walked away from that framework of how they're discussing it, but there's still a possibility of using the budget reconciliation process. That process is incredibly important for Democrats right now because it would allow them to pass an expansive bill with just 50 votes in the Senate rather than the typical 60 votes. So you can imagine that that's a very hard thing for folks to let go of. It's a huge once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And so there are still ongoing conversations about what it would take, what can Democrats reach consensus on where all of their members in the Senate can get on board. We've most recently have heard from Senator Manchin, who is open to a budget reconciliation bill, and he's proposed his own sort of framework around it. He's looking at various ways to raise revenues by increasing corporate tax rates or individual tax rates. He's looking at savings through prescription drug reform. And then he's offered or suggested that Congress split those revenues between deficit reduction and climate change provisions. And we have seen a number of members of Congress, including the Progressive Caucus leader, Representative Jayapal, House Leadership Member, Representative Clyburn, and many others, acknowledge that this is a possible path forward, of course, noting that there could be tweaks. We still think that if Congress uses this framework that Senator Manchin has provided, that could still provide an opportunity for housing resources to be included. No doubt the road will be difficult and uphill, and it'll take a lot of our advocacy, but given the enormous resources that are on the table and what it would mean for the lowest income and those most marginalized households, we do not want to give up on this opportunity to include housing resources in a budget reconciliation bill going forward. And so we want to encourage you on Advocacy Day and any day really between now and when we find out that Build Back Better or a reconciliation bill is either passing or not. We don't want to give up on the opportunity to be talking to members of Congress about why these housing investments are so important, what they mean for your community, what they mean for low-income people. So I'm encouraging all of you to continue to lift up why these investments are important. I will say that a lot of the framework that Senator Manchin has used and that President Biden has used, including in his State of the Union address, has been around addressing inflation and around the rising costs for households. You and me both know that the biggest cost that a household typically has is their housing expense. And so that framework still provides a really good opportunity for us to be talking about housing investments. So I've included in this slide a fact sheet about why housing investments, targeted housing investments, can help address inflation, and why it's important for the other priorities that are likely being discussed in a budget reconciliation bill, including racial equity, climate change, child care provisions, healthcare provisions. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kim.
Thanks, Sarah. And we covered a lot of that outlook and timeline. Thanks to Sarah for giving us that recap. And the only thing that I would add too is we have a sign-on letter for organizations that's currently includes over 1,800 organizations from all across the country, urging Congress to include in any reconciliation package those targeted affordable housing investments. And if I could get the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so as you all likely know, President Biden signed recently a federal spending bill for fiscal year 2022, which will help keep the federal government running until the new fiscal year begins on October 1st. The new spending bill provides HUD programs with about $2.5 billion in increased funding over FY 2021 enacted levels, plus $1.5 billion in earmarked spending, bringing the total for HUD funding to roughly $53.7 billion for this fiscal year. Senators Patrick Leahy and Richard Shelby from Vermont and Alabama, respectively, the chair and ranking member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, are already planning on convening House and Senate appropriations leaders to discuss the FY 2023 spending bill in order to avoid another massive delay like we saw this year. It was only about 5 months late. So it is not too early to start weighing in with your members of Congress on the need for increased funding for affordable housing programs in the FY 23 appropriations bill. We have some specific asks for FY 23. We're of course asking for the highest possible funding for vital HUD and USDA programs, and that includes an expansion of housing vouchers to an additional 200,000 households, significant funding to preserve and expand public housing, robust resources to address homelessness through homelessness assistance grants, and additional funding for the competitive tribal housing program targeted to tribes with the greatest needs. And finally, at least $100 million for legal assistance to prevent evictions. Next slide, please. Thank you. So with the final FY22 bill signed, lawmakers will have until October 1st of 2022 to enact another budget bill for fiscal year 2023. It's unlikely they're going to make that deadline, especially with the election. So we are anticipating a continuing resolution, but nevertheless, it would still be important for legislators to get the FY23 bill finalized. We're also expecting the president to release his budget request for FY23 sometime in the next week or two, which will mark the official kickoff of the FY23 appropriation season. We have started circulating an annual 302B letter that federal, state, and local organizations are all encouraged to join. That letter urges congressional appropriators to provide the highest possible funding for affordable housing and community development programs in the coming fiscal year. And you can join that letter at the link that will be dropped in the chat. And with our partners in the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, or CHCDF, we will be hosting a webinar on March 31st at 3 p.m. Eastern to cover the highlights from the FY22 spending bill and priorities for FY23. And you can register for the webinar at the link that hopefully has been dropped in the chat. Awesome. Thank you so much, Gabby. Next slide, please. And so our next policy priority is preventing eviction and housing instability by creating a permanent national housing stabilization fund. The Eviction Crisis Act, introduced in 2019 and in 2021 by Senators Michael Bennett from a Democrat from Colorado and Rob Portman, a Republican from Ohio. That bill aims to tackle several long-standing systemic issues in eviction prevention and tracking. So among other important provisions, the Eviction Crisis Act would establish an emergency assistance fund to provide temporary financial assistance and stability services to households experiencing a short-term crisis that directly impacts their housing stability. Even before the pandemic, most families in poverty spent at least half of their incomes on rent, leaving virtually no margin for an unexpected expense. So something like a broken down car, or an unreimbursed medical bill, or a temporary decline in income could quickly send vulnerable households down the spiral into housing instability, eviction, and in worst cases, homelessness. Often households facing eviction owed less than $600 in back rent. The pandemic and its resulting economic downturn has magnified and accelerated this trend. And the Emergency Assistance Fund would provide households with short-term bridge loans, or not loans, but funding in order to make it through any of those sudden economic downturns. It would be run as a competitive grant program administered by HUD, with funding distributed to state, local, and tribal governments. Like emergency rental assistance programs, those entities would be able to contract out with nonprofit organizations to help with the distribution of funds. At least 75% of funds would need to be used to provide direct financial assistance to help households overcome a short-term crisis that impacts their housing stability, and the remaining 25% of funds could be used to provide wraparound services like case management, rehousing, and referrals to other supports. Assistance would also be targeted to households with extremely low incomes. So those are households paid 30% or less of area median income, or who are living below the poverty limit, whichever is higher, since extremely low income households are most at risk of homelessness in the wake of an economic shock. The bill also requires rigorous evaluation of the program's effectiveness at preventing housing instability and eviction. So obviously, had the emergency assistance fund been in place before the pandemic, emergency rental assistance grantees would not have had to rapidly set up ERA programs from scratch, because that program would have already provided the long-term infrastructure that's needed to distribute emergency rental assistance quickly and effectively. The bill, which again was introduced last year in the Senate by Senators Bennett and Portman, is slated to be introduced in the House in the coming weeks by Representative Richie Torres of New York. And you can help build support for the Eviction Crisis Act by sending a letter to your members of Congress urging them to support the bill. So I will now hand it back over to Sarah to talk about our next priority, expanding the availability of housing vouchers for households with the lowest incomes.
Thanks so much, Kim. Before I move on, I just wanted to add a little bit on to the Eviction Crisis Act, which is, I know that many of you guys are starting to see in your communities the Treasury emergency rental assistance funds run out. Some programs have already started to close down. And you're wondering, what can I do next to make sure that people in my community are having the resources that they need to be stably housed? The Eviction Crisis Act is a great tool to point to, a great resource that you can be talking to both your Democratic and Republican members of Congress about. We think there could be more bipartisan support for this bill, and we hope you'll raise it with them on Lobby Day and beyond. Thanks for that. We can go to the next slide. I want to speak a little bit about another bill that we're working to build bipartisan support for, the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act. This is another bill like the Eviction Crisis Act that's been endorsed by our Opportunity Starts at Home campaign. So it has the support of a broad number of cross-sector leaders across healthcare, civil rights, child welfare, education, and other sectors. The bill would create 500,000 new housing vouchers for families with young children and would pair that housing assistance with mobility counseling to help families move to areas of their choice. It was introduced last year by Senator Chris Van Hollen and Todd Young, a bipartisan team, and we're looking to build more congressional support for the bill. Hope you raise it on Lobby Day. We think that this bill could have a lot of potential bipartisan support because of that focus on mobility. We know that for many Republican members, for example, they are inspired by and encouraged by the research that was done by Raj Chetty that found that when families, especially with very young children, moved to areas that had access to good performing schools and lower crime rates, that those children were able to earn more over their lifetimes, have higher educational outcomes, and et cetera. And we know from our partners in the healthcare space that likewise, when children have access to affordable housing, they often have better health outcomes as well. And I think that long-term longitudinal effect, cross-generational impact, is why a number of Republicans are interested in this bill. And so we hope you'll raise those aspects about it as well. You can support this bill by sending a letter to your members of Congress using our tool that we have available for you. And next slide. And then I do also want to talk about just one more other opportunity for you to raise on your Lobby Day. With midterms approaching, there is a lot of focus in Congress about voting rights and voter education. We know that Congress is actively engaging in conversations about election reform. When and if those bills are able to move, we would like to see the Our Homes, Our Votes Act added to that. This is a bill that would make it easier for voter registration efforts to happen with within or among residents of federally assisted housing. It would add them to the motor voter law, which would mean that housing providers would provide information about voter registration to tenants when they lease up. It's a bill that's been introduced on the House side only. We're looking to try to expand that to the Senate side soon. But I think this is a really good, tangible way for members of Congress to be showing how much they care about expanding and securing voting rights, especially among low-income renters. We know, and I know that we've talked about this before with many of our partners, that some of the core underlying reasons why Congress does not pay enough attention to the needs of the lowest income and most marginalized households is in part because they vote at lower rates. We need to do everything that we can to secure their vote and protect it. And this is one small, tangible way that we can move in that direction to make sure that everybody's vote is heard. And I'll turn it back over to Kim.
Thanks, Sarah. So while, these are kind of our top priorities, these are the highlights for the purpose of Capitol Hill Day. This is, of course, not all of the legislation that the House campaign supports. You can check out a full list of legislation endorsed by the campaign at the link on your screen. And I will hand it back over to Gabby to close this out and help facilitate Q&A.
Thank you, Kim. So some ways you can take action. Please, first of all, please let your field organizer know if you're setting up meetings and if you need help setting up meetings with your elected officials for Capitol Hill Day. And also, please let us know how your meetings went using the Lobby Day report form that I can drop in the link drop in the chat right now. Done. Okay. Let's see. And of course, all year round, you can be an advocate for affordable housing investments. And a good resource on our website is our Legislative Action Center, which you can access through the link on the screen. And I will drop that in the chat as well. And thank you, Joey. Yes, this is our housing advocacy organizer map by state. So you can find which organizer you need to contact from this map. And we'll be sending out a follow-up email with all the resources we shared today, as well as the recording. Okay, and of course, oh, you can go back to that, Joey. Yeah, you can go back to the membership. Please, we encourage you to become a member of NLIHC just to be more engaged with our work and support our cause. I'll put that link in the chat. Okay, and we can do a Q&A. I saw one question in the chat from Danielle. Hold on one second, I just had it. Okay, so this is from Danielle Mowry, and she was asking, I believe in relation to the Our Homes, Our Votes Act, and if it addresses voting rights for people in shelter.
Yeah, I'm going to see if my colleague Joey is able to join us. I know that he has been very much focused on this bill. I want to give him an opportunity to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I can jump in on that, Sarah. And while voting rights for people in shelter are extremely important, it is not something addressed by the Our Homes, Our Votes Act. The Our Homes, Our Votes Act is really designed to address that so many renters fall off the voter registration rolls when they move. And so the concept is that when you move into a new building, you have to provide proof of your identity and your age, a lot of the same documentation and information you need to provide to register to vote. So much like registering to vote through the DMV, through the motor voter law, for all housing that would be run by public housing agencies, voter registration would be automatic at lease-in or at renewal, where people can just check a box saying, I would like to be registered to vote at this address. For other federally subsidized housing through funding such as the Home Program, the National Housing Trust Fund, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, they would be required, they would be designated as a voter registration site under the law, which is a little bit of a lower threshold, but they would be required to have voter registration materials available to all renters at the time that they move in. Thanks for your question, Danielle.
Thank you, Joey. I don't see any other questions in the chat. But I will say, Sarah, you asked about meetings, and I am your organizer for Maryland, so I can follow up with you after so we can discuss coordinating some meetings for Capitol Hill Day. And yes, all the resources shared in the chat will be shared in the follow-up email that goes out. Okay, I don't think there are any more questions, so I think we can wrap this up unless you guys have any other closing remarks or anything else you wanted to highlight before we leave.
The only thing I wanted to mention is that while our Advocacy Day is one day, really the secret to having a strong relationship with your members of Congress and having helping to influence the work that they do is if you have a consistent engagement with them over time. So rather than thinking about this as a one-time opportunity for you to be meeting with your member of Congress and telling them about what's important, I encourage you to be thinking about this as a long-term strategy and something that you can be doing consistently going forward if you haven't already done it. We've seen a lot of success among our partners in terms of moving members of Congress from being opposing our housing issues to maybe being more neutral, moving from being more neutral maybe to being more supportive to being a champion. There's always a place to move your member of Congress up that ladder of engagement and support.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And the only thing I would add is just a big thank you to everyone on this call for not just joining today, but for all of the advocacy that you've been pushing for the last, 2 years. It certainly has not been easy, but it is worth it to see the results of the work that we're doing. So thank you all so much for everything over the last couple of years.
Okay, so there's actually one more question in the Q&A, and it says, is there a website to see the number of emergency housing vouchers by region besides the HUD website? I don't believe these numbers are live.
Yeah, that's a great question. The only resource I'm aware of is the HUD website. I'm pretty sure that's the only place that is really comprehensively tracking EHV distribution.
Thank you. Okay, so I don't think there are any more questions, so I think we can close it out. Thank you everyone for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you next week if you're participating in the policy forum or Capitol Hill Day. Thank you.